What is up, Longhorn fans, Texas Longhorn fans everywhere? Welcome in to the first inaugural Longhorn Deep Dive. I am your host, Michael Ween, also co host of the Raw Prospect podcast with my co host, Emmy Nixon. This is the first Longhorn Deep Dive where I'm going to bring you my opinions, my perspectives on everything Texas Longhorn sports, whether that be football, basketball, baseball, volleyball, golf, all sports, everything Longhorns, what you need to know, my opinions, my perspectives here as I've been on this campus for about 4 years. Um, that's what I'm going to bring you. And our first episode is here today. We have a great one planned for you here today. We are going to be talking about the Texas basketball team. Tough loss last night in Lubbock, a place that's haunted them the past couple years. We'll get to that and the implications of the Longhorns' loss to the Red Raiders, where they stand right now in the Big 12, and what we can look forward to moving forward after a disappointing loss last night. And then we will talk about the newly released Big 12 football schedule, particularly from a Texas Longhorns perspective. As we know, last year in the Big 12, 4 new teams are joining the Big 12 next season. So the schedule looks a little different than it usually does for Texas as they get Houston and BYU added to their schedule. And so we'll take a look at that. West Virginia and Oklahoma State are subtracted. I'll give you my main takeaways from the schedule, how I think it looks for Texas going to next season. We're going to have probably a couple episodes per week. There's so much to talk about in the world of Texas Longhorns. So we'll have another episode probably Thursday where we're going to preview the Texas baseball season. Opening day is on Friday. The Texas Longhorns open their season in Arlington Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And they play 3 ranked teams, all from the SEC, which is the best conference in baseball. So that's pretty exciting. Texas was a team that reached Omaha each of the past 2 years. Expectations have dropped a little bit coming into this season. However, they still rank in the top 15 in terms of odds to make it to the College World Series. So while they're not preseason number 1 like they were last year, they're not currently ranked in the preseason top 25 as they have been the past couple of years. There are still high expectations in Austin for the Texas Longhorns baseball team. We're going to preview the Longhorns' next basketball matchup, a home matchup against Oklahoma on Saturday. And then we will also probably talk about Texas moving to the SEC 1 year early. So that will be a bigger episode than tonight. But with all that being said, thanks for joining. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to our channel. And let's get right into it. So last night, the number 6 ranked Texas Longhorns basketball team coming in at 20-5 went into Lubbock, a place that has plagued them the past 3-4 years. In fact, since I stepped on this campus in the fall of 2019, there have been 3 Texas Longhorns basketball seasons before this current one. In Texas, the only time Texas won in Lubbock was my freshman year. So with the loss last night, 74-67, a disappointing loss for Texas. That drops them to 20-6 overall, but still tied for the Big 12 lead at 9-4 in conference with a bunch of huge victories. Their first real not so great loss, I will say, came last night, 74-67, at the hands of the Red Raiders in a place where they have struggled historically over the past half decade. Texas Tech gets up for this game. It's a big rivalry, especially in basketball. And Texas Tech, there is some extra animosity towards Texas given the situation with what happened with Texas getting Chris Beard. And where that stands now, of course, is a whole nother situation. But stealing Chris Beard from Texas Tech with what he had done with that program obviously created some extra animosity to what was already a heated rivalry on the basketball court. So Texas loses this game 74-67, drops to 9-4 in the Big 12, still tied, or actually a half game ahead of both Baylor and Kansas coming into tonight, given their head-to-head win over Baylor earlier a couple weeks ago, and then their extra win in conference that Kansas did not have prior to tonight. I'm assuming they beat Oklahoma State, so we might be once again tied with Kansas at the top of the conference as they had the head-to-head over Texas, getting the win in Fog Island last week. Texas will get another shot at them at the end of the regular season at Moody Center. But in terms of last night's game, overall, you have to look big picture. I think when it comes to Texas basketball, this is a team that still sits atop their conference. That is 9 quad one victories. And for those of you who don't know, a quad one victory, as defined in college basketball, is a win against a team ranked in the top 50 in the net rating, which is a metric that heavily weighs into your seeding come March Madness. It's basically a win over a top 50 team in college basketball. Texas has 9 of those such wins, one teams, and coming into last night, they had not had a loss outside of quad one. So all their losses were quality losses, which does not hurt you all that much when it comes to your March Madness seeding line. But last night was their first loss outside of quad one. Not a great loss, but I think, as I was saying before, you have to look bigger picture. This is still a team that, despite that loss, still coming into the night, had a half game lead in the Big 12 with about 3 weeks left to play in conference regular season. 20-6, 9-4 overall in the Big 12. Overall, you're still sitting pretty if you're Texas. Now, in terms of last night, losing 74-67, let's get into why they lost this game. To me, this was about scheduling, which you really can't help. The schedule is what it is. And it was also a shooting loss. Let's start with the first one. Scheduling. What do I mean by that? If you look at the way Texas' schedule was set up and what the circumstances were coming into this game. You lost at Kansas last Monday. Okay. Very close game. Kansas was the better team that night. That's a really, really hard place to play. There's a reason Bill Self has only lost 9 times in his career at Kansas in Fog Island. That's a really tough place to play. Their game that night, but they still competed. And at one point had that, had a chance to win that game in the second half. That's a loss that you kind of expect. And then they come back, they respond well as they've done all season when they've had a loss. They beat the shit out of West Virginia on Saturday at home in the Moody Center, where they have played fantastic elite basketball so far this season, aside from a loss to K-State earlier in Big 12 play. At the start of Rodney Terry's tenure as interim head coach for the Texas Longhorns. You beat the brakes off West Virginia 94-60, a game which probably wire to wire was Texas's best game in the Big 12 in terms of quality of play, not turning the ball over, defensive intensity, shot making, start to finish. I would say that Saturday was probably their best performance from a wire to wire perspective. And then 48 hours later, you have to go on the road, coming off an emotional high, a big win in response to a loss, where you just blew out a team. You played your best game of the year, start to finish. And it is hard in this league, the Big 12, bar none the best conference in America, to keep that intensity, especially on a 48-hour turnaround, where you're going to, over the past 5 years, over the past half decade, you have really struggled. And Texas Tech, it's like their Super Bowl. They really get up for this game, and they know how to play Texas. This is largely the same roster with a couple transfers and a couple more freshmen for Texas that they had last year. Texas Tech plays well defensively against Texas. They sort of know their tendencies, and they get up for this game. And that crowd, it is hard to win once you get down. Why'd they lose? Number one, scheduling. Okay. It was a scheduling loss. Hard to come off a huge win on an emotional high where you just played your best game of the year. Okay. On Saturday, turn around 48 hours later, go on the road to a place you've historically struggled to play and beat a team that's been hot the past couple weeks, despite their sort of underperformance this year overall as a team, as they're sort of fighting to get back into the NCAA tournament conversation. And these wins certainly do help them. This was a team that's been playing better basketball over the past couple weeks. They had a win over K-State a couple weeks ago, and another ranked win over Iowa State. Those are both really good teams. They're going to be relatively high seeds in the NCAA tournament. This is an upset-happy Texas Tech team over the past couple weeks, and they're playing better basketball. Mark Adams, their head coach, knows what he's doing. Still a really talented team, and it's hard coming off a big win to turn around 48 hours later and to keep that intensity that you had on Saturday on the road to a place where you've historically struggled, on a short turnaround. It's hard to keep that intensity, especially in the best conference in college basketball. So I think scheduling in some ways could have had something to do with this loss for Texas last night in Lubbock. Secondly, shooting. The bottom line is Texas was just missing shots that they usually make. Timmy Allen, rough night from the field, the mid-range maestro. So often so good at creating shots in the mid-range, cutting off ball. Just didn't have a good night shooting. Okay. Marcus Carr was great. He kept Texas in the game. Dylan DeSue, from an offensive perspective, had a really good game, one of his better games from an offensive perspective in Big 12 play. However, it just wasn't a good shooting night, both from the free throw line and from the field for Texas. You can't go to any place in the Big 12 on the road in this conference, which is the best conference in college basketball by far, and expect to win shooting 33% from the field in the second half, especially when you came into that half down by 11, 12 points. And despite all of that, and this is a theme of this Texas basketball team because of their experience, they're the 9th most experienced college basketball team in the entire country. They are resilient, and they've proven that. An 18-point comeback at home against TCU, a 14-point comeback on the road against K-State, another 12-point comeback at home against this same Texas Tech team earlier in Big 12 play. They don't panic when they get down, and that's a product of their experience. And so even though you had an off shooting night, if you are Texas, shooting 33% from the field in the second half, when you came into the half down by double digits, guess what? You still tied the game at 64 with 5 minutes to go. Texas had a legitimate chance to win this game despite all of their shooting struggles, both from the free throw line and from the field. And so I think that's one of those smaller silver linings that you can take from this loss if you were a Texas fan. Texas was still legitimately had a shot to win this game with 5 minutes to go, despite not shooting the ball all that particularly well. In fact, it was pretty bad. Same from the free throw line. They missed some big free throws going down the stretch that could have given them a chance to win this game. And it's funny because They've been the best free throw shooting team statistically in the Big 12 this year, and that's a fact. And they were coming off a performance against West Virginia where they made 24 free throws in a row and shot 24 out of 25 from the line. So I don't worry too much about that. I think it's somewhat of an anomaly, and we'll see where it goes from here. Texas has been a really good free throw shooting team all season, which I think bodes well for them come tournament time. But it was just an off night from the field and from the free throw line. And it's hard to win that way against a really well-coached defensive team at Texas Tech in a place where you've historically struggled to win over the past half decade. Shooting was not good. Scheduling, shooting, and then, of course, when you look at what Texas Tech was able to do, you got to give them credit. Sometimes in this conference, you just got to tip your hat. Okay? One team is going to come, and they might just beat you straight up. And I think that's what Texas Tech was able to do last night. They were able to set the tone early with a 7-0 run. Davion Harmon, a transfer from Oklahoma, their point guard, had a big night, 21 points in the first half, was able to do what he wanted to do, going to the basket, creating shots off the dribble, knocking down threes. He was kind of a do-it-all guy last night, keeping that physicality on the defensive end and guarding Marcus Carr and guarding Sir-Jabari Rice. So I think Davion Harmon obviously had a huge part in this. He was the player of the game. So give him credit for what he was able to do on both sides of the floor. And then one long-lasting concern that I have for Texas is obviously their lack of size. And that's hurt them, and it's been a problem throughout Big 12 play. If you are able to get on the glass and be physical with this team on the interior, that's what worries me come tournament time. And Texas Tech out-rebounded Texas 41-29. And they created second chance points off offensive rebounds. And so not having that size on the interior and sometimes struggling to rebound, which gives teams second opportunities. With the elite bigs you see now all around the country in college basketball, that could hurt Texas come tournament time. And so I think if you're Texas, you got to find a way to, despite your somewhat lack of size, to somehow combat these teams on the interior, because this cannot keep happening. Expecting to shoot 33% in the second half. Let Davion Harmon do virtually whatever he wants. End up 25 for the game, 21 in the first half. Off the dribble, going to the basket, off cuts, shooting at the free throw line, and then getting out rebounded, getting dominated on the glass. It's just not a good recipe for success at a place you've historically struggled over the past half decade. So those are kind of my thoughts on the game. Scheduling, I think, had a big part in this loss, given the circumstances coming off a huge blowout win where you played your best game wire to wire, in my opinion, against West Virginia, blowing them out by 34 at home. You're feeling good on an emotional high. You go to 48-hour turnaround, going to the place you historically struggled. They get up for the game. They shoot the lights out. They play well. They match your physicality. They out-rebound you, and they shoot better down the stretch. And you got to give them credit for that. And so, but the good thing if you're Texas, you didn't shoot well. And as I said before, you still had a legitimate chance. You were tied at 64. You still had a legitimate chance to win this game with 5 minutes to go. And you just couldn't get those shots to fall. And that's okay. Sometimes that happens. But bigger picture, you're still sitting pretty, tied atop the Big 12. Okay, I'm not exactly sure where it stands right now. I'm pretty sure you are tied with Kansas and Baylor, who play each other on Saturday, and you still have 2 games against those respective teams. So not a great loss. Rebound at home on Saturday against Oklahoma and go from there. But still, you're sitting pretty. If you're Texas, you can learn from that. And I think it'll bode well for them coming down the home stretch over the last 5 games of the regular season. Okay? So we will be back later this week to preview that matchup against Oklahoma this weekend. Likely on a Thursday, I will do a stream. But with that, we're going to move on to our second and final topic of today. So obviously, last weekend or this past weekend, just before like Thursday or Friday, I think it was, Oklahoma and Texas announced they have officially come to an agreement to lead the Big 12 1 year early, getting out of their TV contract with the Big 12. They come to an agreement with ESPN and Fox to pay them $100 million to leave 1 year early in the summer of 2024 to enter the SEC, leaving the Big 12, giving them 1 more year in the Big 12 next year. The week before that, so 2 weeks ago, just about a little less, the Big 12 announced the new Big 12 football schedule, which was much anticipated given that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, with the new realignment going on in college athletics, especially college football, UCF, Houston, Cincinnati, and BYU are now entering the Big 12 next year. And they were included in the release of the Big 12 football schedule for 2023. And so what I want to do is look at Texas's new schedule, give you my main takeaways and sort of what it looks like going into next year. Now, we're not going to make any predictions. It's way too early for that. But I'll give you my feel for how everything worked out in this schedule release for Texas with some new opponents on their schedule and some missing ones that we'll talk about. So let's head on over to the schedule and let's just go through it first. Okay? Let's just go through the schedule first and then I'll get into my takeaways. You open up home against Rice. Then you have the second of the home and home series at Alabama in Tuscaloosa. That'll be a tough game. Home against Wyoming. Okay, and that does it for the non-conference. 3-game non-conference schedule. Then you enter Big 12 play. You go at Baylor, Kansas, and then Kansas at home, and then Red River. Okay, at the Cotton Bowl versus Oklahoma. Then you get your bye. And then after the bye week, you have 2 new opponents coming right out of the bye week. At Houston, which should be a really fun game. Okay. And then home against BYU. Okay. And then after that, you finish home against K-State, the Big 12 champions of last season, at TCU, at Iowa State, and then home against Texas Tech to finish the season the Friday after Thanksgiving, the week before the Big 12 championship. That is your 2023 Texas Longhorns football schedule. Now let's get into my takeaways. Just looking at the schedule the past couple of weeks since it's been released. Number 1, I think Texas got a relatively good break considering the circumstances. There was a chance that given what we know about Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12, that the Big 12 Conference and their new commissioner, Brett Yormark, who's a really smart guy, and since taking over, give him credit, he's done some really good things as Big 12 commissioner. But there was a really good chance, and I think a lot of Texas fans felt this. I think a lot of OU fans even felt this, that the Big 12 was going to screw both Texas and Oklahoma over with this schedule. But, and I'm not really sure from an Oklahoma perspective, I haven't looked too deep into it, but I think Texas got a pretty good break here, considering all the circumstances. Let me explain. First of all teams only get one bye week. And if you're Texas, you got to be really happy about where that bye week sits for you. 6 games before the bye week and 6 games after the bye week. That is the perfect spot for the bye week, right in the middle of the season, right after you finish your first half schedule, right after the Cotton Bowl. Okay, right after you play OU, you get your bye week, and then you have 6 games after the bye week. I think that's a perfectly placed bye week, right where you want to have it, right smack dab in the middle of your season. Okay, I think that's fantastic. You get your bye week right in the middle of the season. Secondly, and this is something that really stands out when you look at the schedule, which hasn't been the case in most other years. Despite adding 2 new teams to the schedule, BYU and Houston, okay, and despite, not in, of course, subtracting West Virginia and Oklahoma State, who Texas will not play next year. They're done playing those teams for the foreseeable future as they'll enter the SEC after next year. Given the 2 new added opponents, if you're Texas, you only have to leave the state of Texas twice and only once in conference play. That is a huge break. Huge scheduling break if you're the Texas Longhorns football team. Only have to leave the state of Texas twice on this football schedule. Once in non-conference going to Alabama, and once in conference going to Iowa State. Huge break. All your other road games are in state. At Baylor, in Waco, of course. At TCU. Let's see. And at Houston. All of those games are, of course, in the state of Texas. They're still road games, but they're in the state of Texas, and you don't have to travel as far. And with Steve Sarkisian's early struggles in his first 2 years at Texas, although they did win their last 2 road games last year, but given, and we did see some growth, given his struggles at Texas on the road, that's a huge break in my opinion. Only have to go to Alabama, which will be tough, and to Iowa State near the end of the season, which has always historically been tough, but only 2 games out of the state of Texas. Only 1 game out of the state of Texas in conference play. I think that's a huge break for Texas. So, number 1, bye week right in the middle of your season, and you don't have to leave the state all that often, only twice over the course of the season. I think those are 2 huge scheduling breaks for Texas. And overall, I mean, I think it's a pretty favorable schedule. Aside from the fact that in non-conference, you, of course, have to go to Alabama. But if you think about Alabama right now, 2 new coordinators. They're going to have a new quarterback. They're going to lose a lot to the draft, including their best player on each side of the ball, and Bryce Young and Will Anderson. There's a lot of turnover in the Alabama program. And, of course, we're not going to doubt Nick Saban. He finished with the number 1 recruiting class this year. But if you're Texas, you have the continuity advantage going into that game. And that's a fact. 17 out of 22 returning starters. With a new quarterback on the other side and new coordinators trying to figure out in their first month, you never know. I'm not saying I expect Texas to win that game, but I think when you look at it from that 30,000-foot perspective, it doesn't look as daunting as it could be. That's what I'll say. And I think that's a more winnable game than people think. And then aside from the OU game, which is always huge, but I think Texas will be able to win, the one spot that worries me is, of course, the back-to-back home games before you play Texas Tech to end the year at TCU and at Iowa State, back-to-back to finish the season. Because at that point, I think that Texas, given what I expect to happen, and we're not going to get into that yet. Okay, that'll be for a later episode. As far as my predictions are concerned, but given what I think could be for this Texas football season, and given what they have on the roster, recruiting, everything that's happened in the transfer portal, given my expectations for this team, coming down the stretch, those last 3 games at Iowa State, or at TCU, at Iowa State, and then Texas Tech, 2 back-to-back road games, those will be important games, likely, in terms of whether or not Texas will end up playing in the Big 12 championship game. Given what I see before that, they should probably be a 1 or 2 loss team at the most going into that game. And those games will be important in deciding whether or not I think they'll get to the Big 12 championship game, which in my opinion, and I'll go ahead and say this right now, is a minimum expectation for their last year in the Big 12 before they go to the SEC for Steve Sarkisian and this Texas Longhorn football team, given all the circumstances that I mentioned previously. 17 returning starters, relatively good breaks in your schedule. You have some continuity. You finish with the 3rd best recruiting class. A lot of those guys should be able to come in and contribute right away in what you've done in the transfer portal. I think there's no reason that at that point in your schedule, you shouldn't be in a driver's seat to get to the Big 12 championship game, which once again is, and we'll talk about this a lot more down the road in future podcasts, but I think that's the minimum expectation for Steve Sarkisian in year 3. Whether that's 9-3 or 10-2, I don't know. Okay, but you got to be there. You got to be in Arlington come December 2nd at AT&T Stadium playing in the Big 12 championship game. Because in my opinion, you cannot go to the SEC in what will be year 4 under this current coaching staff, under Steve Sarkisian, and not have at least made the Big 12 championship game in your first 3 years in the Big 12. Because the SEC, and we'll get into this once again at a later date, is a whole different animal, as we have seen. So I think that's the one spot that I worry about at TCU and at Iowa State, because it's hard to win back-to-back road games, especially in this conference or in any conference. And let's be honest, those are 2 places in particular at TCU, even though they won the last time they were played at TCU, and then at Iowa State especially, where Texas has struggled to win for whatever reasons. And look, that'll be the last time for a long while that they're going to TCU, that they're going to Ames. So those crowds are going to be amped up to a special level. Okay. Likely wanting to ruin Texas's chances and aspirations to get to Arlington, Texas, December 2nd for the Big 12 championship game. So obviously, going to Alabama is going to be a challenge. And then those 2 back-to-back road games to finish the year before you finish with Texas Tech will be tough. But other than that, I think Texas got a relatively fairly easy schedule. Good breaks, bye week right in the middle of the season. You only have to lead the state of Texas twice, once in non-conference and only once in Big 12 play. And considering what the Big 12 could have done, possibly sending them in late November to go play a team like Cincinnati, having Oklahoma State back on the schedule, doing so many things that I thought they might do before this schedule release. I think Texas got the good end of the stick here, which is pretty exciting. Now, at a later date, we'll get into what I think is going to, how this is going to play out, probably in a couple months. After the spring game, maybe I'll do a first run through the schedule and my predictions after I've actually seen the team as currently constructed and some new possible transfer portal additions. However, right now, I think it sets up well if you're Texas going into the 2023 football season. So that for tonight, folks, is going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you guys tune into this at a later time. I will be back likely on Thursday to preview the Texas baseball season, preview and talk about Texas basketball's big home matchup against the Oklahoma Sooners, who are coming off a big win over K-State tonight. And to likely talk more about Texas moving early to the SEC and the implications of that as a football perspective goes. So it'll be likely a longer episode. But for the inaugural episode of the Deep Dive, the Longhorn Deep Dive, that's going to do it. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you tune in to Emmy and I's podcasts on a weekly basis here in the Raw Prospect Podcast YouTube channel. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. And for all you Longhorn fans out there, I will see you on Thursday. But until then, hook 'em horns, keep those horns up, and peace out.